dying. I mean, I know a lot of old people who are extremely successful, and they will live over 100. They are like 90, 80 right now, and they are extremely healthy. They're happy with their lives. They're very wealthy. They don't have any reason to die, and they won't die. So all that wealth becomes monopolized by old people, and so young people are like, why would I want to have children? Why would I want to work hard? Why do I even want to be ambitious? There's no point. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, all right. Good, great question. Any more questions before I continue? All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to summarize what we learned, okay? Just so you have a clear understanding of how everything fits together. All right, so feudalism. What is feudalism? This is a system that was in Europe for 100 years, okay, in something called the High Middle Ages or the Late Middle Ages, which was maybe about the year 1000 to 1400, okay, 1500, okay? So how does feudalism work? Feudalism works because each part of society, it's partitioned into different lands run by lords, okay? Maybe Lord A, Lord B, Lord C, Lord D. And the king was more of a figurehead. And he really didn't have that much authority over the local regions because each region has their own army with castles. So it's very hard to invade every single part, okay? And so whenever there's a war, what would happen is the king says, okay, guys, we need to go to war. So A would come in with his army, B would come in with his army, then C, then D. And they would fight independently, okay? And what would often happen is that maybe C betrays the king, okay? This would happen a lot in European history. But this is how most wars are fought in the feudal era, okay? Now, with gunpowder, you need centralization. Why? Because the thing about gunpowder, as I discussed, is you need a huge army in order to best effectively use this gunpowder. So you need two things, taxation and conscription. And therefore, you need a bureaucracy. Okay? Does that make sense, guys? You need to resolve these two issues. You have to tax people to create a central army, and you need to conscript people to fill the ranks of your army. You can only do it through a centralized bureaucracy. Therefore, at this time, historians say that feudalism transitioned into an absolute monarchy, where the king now has absolute power, because only the king can organize a centralized bureaucracy. Okay? So now, what happened is that the king would ask for conscripts from all lands to create a centralized army. Okay? So, why you need to do this is the nature of gunpowder. So remember before, soldiers were self-sufficient. If there was a battle, they just went and got their armor and then the sword, and then they'd go off to battle, okay? With gunpowder, you need different elements, okay? First of all, you need material. The two main materials, sulfur and salt pepper. And therefore, you needed to do trade and production. Okay? You needed to create a gunpowder economy if you are to have a gunpowder army. But you also need specialists. Specialists are just people who are able to make gunpowder and who are able to use gunpowder in battle. Okay? You need industry. Industry are people who manufacture gunpowder and manufacture cannons. You need research. And these are just scientists who help you refine gunpowder over time. Okay? You also need a bureaucracy to coordinate. And you also need a military hierarchy. Why? Because these soldiers need to be trained on how to use the guns. Okay? So you need a hierarchy. to control the training of soldiers and the deployment of soldiers in battle. Okay? So I mean, like, this is very simple, what I'm doing. But as you can see, what this means is you need what we call a whole society approach. Okay? You have to radically transform your society so that all resources are directed to the use of gunpowder in battle. And the society that is most able to do this will be the most effective in war, okay? And who are the people who are most able to do this over time? The Prussians, which will become Germany, and the Japanese, okay? And these are just two examples. Also the Americans as well. And they are the most effective in war, a whole society approach. Now, the question then is, well, okay, the logic here makes sense, but why is it that it's Europe that used a whole society approach and not China, not the Ottomans, not the Indians, okay? And the reason why is whole society approach means a radical transformation of your social hierarchy and social order. That's the reason why. All right? So the three major changes, as we discussed, is to go from feudalism, okay, basically an aristocracy, to a bureaucracy, okay, a national bureaucracy, bureaucrats. So the power shifts from the aristocrats to the bureaucrats, okay? That's one radical social change. But then you have to go from agriculture to industry. The merchants. So now you have to give the merchants, the capitalists, tradespeople, more power in your society, right? And the bureaucrats don't want that, okay? And then you have to go from religion to science. So now the people with the most authority in your society are no longer priests, which has historically been true, but scientists, right? So this is a radical social transformation that overturns the entire social hierarchy. And that's why this is really important. This is a process that will take centuries and which will lead to traumatic social revolution, including the French Revolution and the American Revolutions. Okay? We'll be discussing this later on. Okay? So that's what you have to do. And most societies are not willing to do this because the elite don't want to give up power. Okay? It's that simple. Okay? The elite do not want to give up power. Their power has to be taken away from them. Okay? So let me give you an example to illustrate how hard it is to transform society. Okay? All right. So let's look at China. Let's look at Europe. Hey, guys. So China is one of the first societies to centralize. And when you centralize, you accumulate a lot of resources, and these resources allow you to make great inventions. And so the four great inventions of China are the compass, right? Paper, printmaking, and gunpowder. Okay, these are the four great inventions of China. China was the first to invent this by hundreds of years, okay? So the printing press in China was maybe about the year 800. In Europe, it would be 1400, okay? So this is like a huge advantage over Europe. But these four inventions did not really impact society in China. They had no impact on society. But in Europe, when they go over to Europe, the compass will bring in the age of exploration, right? It will allow Europe to conquer the entire world, the age of exploration, right? Paper and printmaking, what does it do? It creates universal literacy. Everyone in Europe is now able to read and write because of paper and printmaking. It radically transforms the entire fabric of European society. And because people are now able to read and write, it gives rise to the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, the Silent Revolution, okay? And the gunpowder allows Europe to conquer the entire world, conquest. Okay? So think about that. China was the first to invent all four, and Europe was able to take all four and radically transform the society and make Europe into the dominant power in the entire world. Right? So then the question then is, why is it China didn't make use of these four inventions? Just look at paper and printmaking, okay? The problem in China is that you have these Confucian bureaucrats. And what is their source of power? It's the monopoly over literacy and knowledge production, right? So they didn't want to make it possible for everyone to read and write because that would reduce their power over the people, right? Does that make sense? Same thing with the compass. The compass would allow Chinese to explore the world and bring in new ideas and new goods. The bureaucrats didn't want that. They wanted to protect the social hierarchy. With gunpowder, yeah, it's fine, but the problem is if now everyone has a gun, they can revolt against you, right? Okay? So for China, it was much more important to maintain a social hierarchy than it is to innovate and to dominate the world. In fact, what's important for us to remember is that if you give governments a choice, they would always choose to maintain a social hierarchy rather than to innovate, because that's just the easiest thing to do. But, and this is important, Europe didn't have a choice in the matter. It was a matter of life and death. You either innovate or you will get destroyed by your neighbor. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, great. Okay, so we did a broad overview of the history, and we'll go into very specific details over the next few weeks, okay? So next class will be on the Enlightenment, which will then give rise to the French Revolution and the American Revolution, okay? All right? So, but this is just a very broad overview. All right, so questions, guys? Yes?
So, is there like the Chinese bureaucracy want to keep the social hierarchy?
Yes.
And instead of being innovative, so and is there like Europe they didn't have a choice? Like why? Didn't they have like they had the royal families, they have the social classes, so they want to keep the social hierarchy.
Okay, so why did Europe innovate, right? Okay, great. So let's look at Europe. Like, let's just look at France, okay? Okay, so as a nation, you are under two types of pressure. External, okay? External just means Britain, Russia, Germany, Holy Roman Empire. Okay, you have a lot of enemies. Okay? And so you're competing against them. At the same time, this is really important, you have internal pressure as well, okay? Because remember, what they're doing now is they're recruiting more and more people to join your army. And the general rule is that if people fight for you, if they die for you, they also have a say in your society. Okay? Also, you need to get people to have children to replenish your population. You need everyone you need to get them to work hard, okay? So you're always afraid of revolution, discontent, and also the idea of indifference, right? People don't care anymore. So you're under these two pressures. So because of these two pressures, it creates contradictions in your society. And these contradictions force you to balance these contradictions, which leads to innovation. Okay? Does that logic here make sense to you? Right? This creates conflict and contradiction, right? Which will then lead to innovation. And if you don't innovate, then you have a revolution or defeat, okay? Does that make sense? If you don't innovate, your enemies will come and conquer you, or your people will rebel and overthrow you, okay? Those are the two options. You don't have a choice in the matter but to innovate. But sometimes the innovation can't keep up with the social change. And that's what happened in the French Revolution, which we will discuss later on, is that, okay, the government was trying to make these changes, but you have too many social classes. The merchant class, the educated middle class, lawyers, basically. You have all these different social groups now who want a greater say in government, but then you have this hierarchy of like clergy, nobility, and bureaucrats who want to maintain their privileges. Okay? And if you can't resolve this conflict, then the only outcome is revolution. All right? So it's either you choose to resolve it or it will be resolved for you. Okay? So this is a process of constant innovation and revolution. Okay? But, yeah?
So didn't China have the same problem? Didn't they have enemies or, I mean, I think they have revolutions. I mean, like, we always have like a region that have different dynasties.
Okay. All right. That's a good question. Okay. So why isn't this happening in China? Okay. All right. So the first thing about China, that's it from Europe, is that China for the longest time has been much more united. And there are natural boundaries that protect China. Okay. So the sea, the mountains, the desert to the north. Okay. So China has these natural boundaries that Europe doesn't have. So from the perspective of Chinese bureaucrats, they're not afraid of external enemies, okay? Because like Japan, Korea, they're not really threats to China at this time. They're more afraid of internal revolution, okay? So that's where the focus is on, like, how do we maintain internal coherence? And the best way to do that is by co-opting the local elite, by bribing the local elite, okay? And the best way to bribe the local elite is by helping them stamp out local discontent, ensuring that the people that are most loyal to you are always in power in local areas. Okay? Does that make sense? So the example is this. The example is, think back to the Japanese invasion of China, okay, World War II. You look at the KMT, the Kuomintang, which is the dominant power in China. Japan is coming in, conquering most of China, controlling the industrial heartland. And what is Jiang Jieshi doing? Does he care about the Japanese? Not at all. He cares about the Communist Party. These peasants in these caves in northwest China. Why? The Japanese are a much greater military threat, but they are not a threat to the social hierarchy. You can work with the Japanese, right? The Japanese are perfectly willing to work with you to control China. The communists represent an overturning of the social hierarchy. Therefore, they are a much greater threat. Okay? Does that make sense? But that's a logic in China. Okay? Maintain the social hierarchy. If foreigners want to come and conquer China, that's fine because we can work with them to maintain the social hierarchy. Okay? But these peasant rebels are the real problem. Okay?
So if China is already trying their best for stabilization, why our dynasty is still not lasting long? Or say, if they are only valued for a social hierarchy, but they are actually not mind that which emperor is exactly who it is.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a great question. Okay. Why is it that Chinese dynasties don't last very long, right? Okay. So I know this is hard to understand, but what Chinese civilization is, it's a bureaucracy. Okay? The bureaucracy. Because the bureaucracy represents a social hierarchy. Okay? Confucianism. If the Confucian culture lives on, China lives on. So what's important is to protect the Confucian culture, which puts scholar officials, the bureaucrats, at the top of society. So you can have the Mongols, you can have the Japanese, you can have, I don't know, Jiang, who cares? The emperor doesn't matter. You understand? The emperor doesn't really matter in this system. What matters is the bureaucracy. And that has been consistent for 2,000 years. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so the intention, the strategy is to maintain a bureaucracy, even though you may need to put in a foreign leader. Okay? In fact, you're better off a foreign leader because the foreign leader is much more dependent on the bureaucracy than maybe a local leader.
So they actually don't care about who it is, the emperor, right?
Yeah, it doesn't matter. The emperor is just a figurehead. The emperor has no power, right? Because you think about it, the emperor is just one person. But the information that he gets is all from bureaucrats. And therefore, you can control and manipulate the emperor based on the information you provide him. Right? So it's a bureaucracy that has all the power. And that's why China doesn't innovate, because the bureaucracy is too powerful. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, great. Questions?
So, European countries, they're all kind of related with each other in some way. Like their nobilities are intermarried or brother or sisters.
Yeah.
So why didn't they think about unification? Right?
Yeah, okay, so that's a great question, okay? So the thing about the European nations is that even though they're divided, they are basically one big family, okay? Like, so for example, the Germans, the Russians, the English, they were just like one big family. They were cousins of each other, but they still went to war and they still killed millions of people, okay? So how to explain this? And the answer is, we can use game theory, okay? Game theory. And the idea of game theory is that you can be related to each other, but you're all participants in a game in which they're going to be one winner, right? So you still have to think about your own survival. And you can survive as long as you have as long as you have authority and legitimacy among your people, right? Because if they think that you are representing a foreign interest, your soldiers won't be loyal to you. They'll kill you. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay? And also, look, there's a very common, very simple example where it's very common that a king dies, right? And guess what? What? The two sons start a civil war. Right? They're brothers. But why are they fighting a civil war? And the reason why is, okay, this is really interesting, is they represent different political factions who are all striving for power. And the sons are just figureheads for these political factions. Okay, does that make sense? Okay? Okay, so civil wars are fought between different political factions, and they will appoint maybe son A to be the head, okay? And son A, if he doesn't agree, they'll find someone else, okay? So everyone's trying to be the top dog. It's really, okay, yeah, so there's a theory, but the theory is called status. What we really want is status, right? And so brothers hate each other the most because only one can have status. The other must obey. Okay? And that's why throughout history, so much violence has been between princes, okay, who are striving for this top position. So there are different theories. Okay? Great. Any more questions?
You mentioned that in Europe, schools were institutions that create soldiers, and that's kind of not the case in China, where Confucius and all that academy in China. And but you mentioned that later on, China also adopted the European ways. So how did that happen?
Okay. So let's go over the history of schooling, okay? So the modern schooling model that we use today is from Prussia. Okay, Prussia. Okay, schools. Okay, and so if you are a military, you need soldiers. And what you discover is if you want soldiers to be obedient, you need to train them from an early age. But not only that, but you need to separate them from their families at an early age. Okay, does that make sense? Because if they are separated from their families, they feel more anxious, they feel more stressed, they're less loved. Therefore, they're much willing to accept authority. And they're much more willing to kill other people. Okay? So that's a basic theory of schooling. Make them obedient from an early age, and separate them from the families from an early age, and then train them to be soldiers from an early age. Okay? And this is a model that we adopt for today, universal schooling. And every country uses this system because not only is it good for the military, but it's also good for industry, right? Companies also want this system where you go in and you work hard because you're anxious. You want to make money. You want to prove yourself, right? Whereas if you feel loved by your family, you don't care. You're like, I don't like this boss. I'm going to go home and be with my mother, okay? So that's why every nation adopted the system. Because it was intended for the military, but it really helps with the industry, okay? So the question then is, why did China adopt this? Well, because of industry, right? Because China needs factory workers. And this system gives you the best factory workers. Okay? Does that make sense? Great. Any more questions? Okay, so great questions, guys. I really enjoy it when you ask questions, and like they're really perceptive, okay? And I think that by asking them, you learn a lot as well. So next class, we do the Enlightenment, okay? And this will pave the way for the American and the French revolutions. There's no class next week because of midterms, but I'll see you after the midterms, okay?